The year, the year was 1892, deep in the Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri, a land both beautiful and cruel. The forests stretched for miles, thick with oak and pine, their roots tangled in secrets older than memory. Fog clung to the valleys like something alive, and at dusk, when the sun dipped behind the ridges, the world turned a dim gray that swallowed sound. Folks said the land could hear you if you weren't careful. Every whisper, every lie, every prayer. And some said it remembered the heart of this wilderness was a hollow, a dark, sunless crease between two steep ridges known as Black Hollow. The soil there was richer than anywhere else, black and damp, fed by something people couldn't quite name. It was a place where animals wouldn't linger, where travelers crossed themselves without meaning to. Even the wind changed when it passed through that hollow, carrying with it a low hum like someone whispering just out of reach. Just outside the hollow sat a scatter of weather-beaten cabins and farms. The people who lived there were rough folk, loggers, trappers, and settlers who built their homes from the same trees they felled. Life was simple, ruled by hard work and silence. They kept to themselves, not out of pride, but out of fear. In these hills, gossip could kill faster than a bullet, and superstition was the only law that never failed. There was one cabin, though, that no one would go near once the sun fell. It stood on a slope above the hollow, leaning slightly to one side, as if it were tired of standing. Smoke never rose from its chimney, but sometimes a faint light flickered through its windows long after midnight. That cabin belonged to a woman whose name people barely spoke aloud anymore. They called her the Mountain Witch. Some said she'd been born there long before most of the settlers came, a woman untouched by time. Others swore she was a widow who had gone, mad after her family died, living alone with her grief until grief became her only companion. No one knew for sure, and no one was brave or foolish enough to ask the townsfolk of nearby Forsyth. She was the reason livestock vanished, the reason children woke screaming in the night, the reason crops turned black after a long rain. But no one ever caught her harming. No one ever saw her curse or cast a hex on anyone. Still, every wrong thing that happened in those hills found its way back to her name. Before the trouble began, life in the Ozarks followed a rhythm older than the railroads that had begun snaking their way across Missouri. Mornings were for work, evenings for prayer, and Sundays for the one-room church that doubled as a schoolhouse. The preacher, Reverend Elias Porter, was a tall man with a face that looked carved from stone and a voice that carried like thunder. He believed God had sent him to chase out the devil that lived in the hills. His sermons often spoke of sin hiding in plain sight, wearing the faces of neighbors, friends, even family. And every time he preached, people's eyes drifted toward the woods, toward that hollow. The woman in the cabin had once been a part of that world, though most had forgotten it. Years ago, she'd come to town to trade herbs and tonics for food and supplies. Her remedies worked better than any doctor's, though few would admit it. But when her cures began to fail, when a fever swept through the valley, taking children first and men soon after, the town turned on her. They said she'd brought the sickness, not healing. They said she'd made a deal with something dark that lived beneath the mountain. By the time the fever broke, her cabin had already been burned once. She rebuilt it herself, stone by stone, and never returned to town again. The years after that passed quietly, but the memory of her never faded. People swore they'd seen her walking by the creek under a full moon, her hair white as frost, her hands buried in the soil like she was planting something alive. Others claimed they heard her humming to the trees, and that the forest hummed back. Most just kept their distance, afraid that even speaking her name might draw her attention. But peace, if it ever existed, was about to end. Because in that same autumn of 1892, something strange began to stir in the hollow again. Livestock were found dead, their bodies untouched, but their eyes missing. Children began waking in the night, saying they'd heard a woman's voice whispering their names from the woods. And one morning, a logger named Samuel Griggs didn't come home from work. His axe was found by the creek, blade buried in the mud, but there was no sign of him, only a set of footprints that led into the hollow and never came out. The sheriff, a quiet man named Clay Marin, didn't believe in curses or witches. He'd fought in the war and seen worse than ghost stories. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him as he searched for Samuel. The deeper he went, the colder the air grew. And when he finally reached the clearing near that old cabin, the hair on his arms stood up. The cabin door was open, just slightly, swinging back and forth in the wind. Inside, something moved. The sheriff didn't go in that day. He turned back, said nothing, and told the others they'd search again come morning. But by then, word had spread. By nightfall, every man in town had gathered with torches and rifles. The Reverend called it God's will, that they should end whatever evil lived in that hollow once and for all, and no one knew it then. But that night would change the Ozarks forever. By the time dawn came, the cabin would burn again. Blood would stain the soil blacker than before. And though no one would speak of it for years, the curse of the mountain, which of Black Hollow, was only just beginning to be why the time the leaves turned red that year, the people of Forsyth had started watching the woods more than they watched each other. Every morning brought another story. Animals missing, tools found broken, strange noises echoing through the valley at night. What had once been superstition was now fear, and fear spreads faster than truth ever can. The Reverend was the first to speak openly of it in church. His voice trembled with something between anger and pride as he warned the townsfolk that evil doesn't die on its own. It must be driven out. The men nodded. The women held their children tighter, and before long, no one dared walk alone after dark. Some claimed the witch's spirit had woken again, that she was calling back the souls of those who'd wronged her. Others thought it was something worse, something she had left behind that was now free to move without her. Sheriff Marin had heard it all before. He'd spent most of his life chasing down stories that began with whispers and ended with blood. But even he couldn't ignore what was happening. He'd been there when the cabin burned 20 years earlier. He'd seen what was left inside, or what wasn't. That night still followed him in dreams, though he'd never told a soul what he truly saw in that hollow. Now, with another man missing, he felt that same cold dread in his chest. He tried to keep his head, tried to find reason where there was none, but every trail led back to that cabin, back to her. And every time he closed his eyes, he could see her face. Not how it was the night they dragged her out, but how it looked before the fire touched her. Pale, calm, almost peaceful. Reverend Porter didn't see peace in that face. To him, she was the devil's work left unfinished. He'd built his whole standing in the town on fear. Fear of hell, fear of judgment, fear of the witch's curse. He knew if that fear faded, so would his hold over the people. So, when the first frost came and another child disappeared for a night, he seized his chance. He told the congregation that the witch's soul still roamed the hollow, that her curse had found a new body to live in. That body, he hinted, belonged to someone living among them now. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. Some said it was the widow who lived near the creek, the one who always wore black, even after 3 years had passed since her husband's death. Others said it was the schoolteacher, a quiet woman from St. Louis who'd moved to the Ozarks for peace and ended up surrounded by whispers. But the name that kept coming up was Grace Marin, the sheriff's own daughter. Grace was 22, strong-willed, and too outspoken for her own good, or so people said. She had her mother's kindness, but none of her caution. Since her mother died, he'd run the household alone, helping her father with the town records and tending to her younger brother. She didn't believe in curses or old wives' tales. When the men talked of hunting down spirits, she laughed. You can't shoot what you can't see, she'd say. It was her laughter that made people uneasy. In a place that survived on fear, someone unafraid was dangerous. The Reverend noticed that too. He watched her from the pulpit, the way she never bowed her head during prayer, the way her eyes stayed open, unflinching. It didn't help that she'd been seen near the hollow once or twice, collecting wild herbs for medicine. To the townsfolk, that was enough. To the Reverend, it was proof. Sheriff Marin tried to protect her, tried to shut down the talk before it spread. But the more he defended her, the more they whispered. They said the curse had chosen her because of him, that her blood carried the stain of the witch's death, that the sins of the fathers never truly die, Tension thickened like smoke over the town. Neighbors who'd once shared bread now crossed the street to avoid each other. Men began keeping rifles by the door. Even the forest seemed to grow darker, as if the trees themselves had taken sides. And then came the night of the firelight meeting that a group of men gathered behind the church, torches burning low, breath clouding in the cold. The Reverend stood among them, reading from his Bible, his voice low but sharp. "The Lord will not suffer a witch to live," he said. They repeated it after him, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Sheriff Marin arrived late, drawn by the glow. When he saw his daughter's name on their lips, something in him broke. He stepped between them and the church, gun drawn, eyes wild. "You'll not lay a hand on her," he said. "If there's evil here, it's not my daughter. It's in the hearts of men who'd burn their own to feel holy." The crowd went silent, the only sound the crackle of fire and the whisper of the wind through the pines. But the Reverend's gaze didn't waver. "You of all people should know, Sheriff," he said softly. "Sin passes down the line. It began with your mercy years ago. You spare her once, and now her spirit's taken what's yours." That night, the sheriff took Grace and his son and fled to the edge of the hollow. He thought the woods would hide them, that the darkness would keep them safe. But even the trees seemed restless, shifting in the wind like they were alive. Grace tried to comfort her brother, humming softly the same lullaby her mother used to sing. It was a tune that always made the sheriff uneasy, an old mountain melody that people said belonged to the witch herself. As the night deepened, he couldn't shake the feeling they weren't alone. He saw movement between the trees, shapes that didn't belong to man or beast. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a woman's voice called his name. Soft, almost tender, he told himself it was the wind. He told himself the mind plays tricks in fear. But then his son began to cry, pointing toward the darkness. "Pa," he said, trembling, "she's right there." By morning, the sheriff returned to town alone. His clothes were torn, his eyes hollow. He didn't speak for 2 days. When he finally did, his voice was cracked and dry. "The woods took them," he said. "The hollow opened up and took them." The Reverend told the town it was the curse claiming its own. He said the witch's soul had passed into Grace, and now that she was gone, the land would rest again. But the land didn't rest. Not a week later, the church bell began ringing in the middle of the night. When the townsfolk came running, they found the door wide open and the Reverend's Bible lying on the floor, pages soaked in blood. His body was never found. After that, people started leaving. Families packed up in the middle of the night, heading east or south, anywhere but there. The few who stayed swore they could hear the bell tolling on windless nights, and a woman's voice singing from the hollow. Some said it was the witch's ghost. Others said it was Grace calling her father home. But those who truly listened knew it wasn't either of them. It was the land itself, remembering what had been done to it, what had been buried beneath its soil. And from then on, Black Hollow was never silent again. The night it happened, the sky above Black Hollow was the color of bruised iron. The moon hid behind thick clouds, and the wind crawled low through the trees, slow and heavy, like it was waiting for something. Not a single bird called. Even the crickets had gone silent. It was the kind of night that made a man's breath feel loud, the kind where you could hear your own heartbeat echoing in your ears. Sheriff Marin hadn't slept in days. His hands shook when he loaded his rifle, his mind a tangled mess of guilt and dread. Since Grace and his boy had vanished, he'd been searching every inch of the forest. He barely spoke, barely ate. The town thought he'd gone mad, walking the ridges alone with a lantern that burned long past midnight. They didn't see the things he saw, the figures at the edge of the light, the footprints that began in front of him and ended in nothing. Every night, he heard her voice again, soft as breath, whispering his name from somewhere, just beyond reach. But this night felt different. The air carried something sharp, something final. Down in the hollow, men were gathering again. Reverend Porter's followers, armed with rifles, axes, and the kind of fear that turns men cruel. They said they'd found proof, the witch's mark carved into a tree near the creek, the same place Grace was last seen. They believed she'd come back, or that her spirit had taken someone new. Some whispered that it was the sheriff himself. Others said his wife's ghost had returned to claim the rest of them. But all agreed. The hollow had to be cleansed once and for all. Lanterns swung in the dark as they moved through the trees, their light catching on the wet leaves, making the forest look like it was alive and bleeding. The Reverend led them, Bible in one hand, pistol in the other. His eyes were wild, his voice hoarse as he prayed under his breath. "Deliver us from evil," he muttered over and over, the words trembling out like a warning to the night itself. By the time they reached the clearing where the old cabin stood, the wind had stopped entirely. The air was so still it hurt to breathe. The cabin leaned in the same tired way it always had, its windows dark and empty. But something felt wrong. The ground was wet though it hadn't rained, and the smell, something sweet and rotting, hung heavy in the air. The men spread out, circling the clearing. Their boots sank into the mud, the sound muffled like the earth was swallowing it whole. Sheriff Marin stepped forward, lantern held high. "Nobody moves till I say," he whispered. His voice cracked on the last word. He could feel eyes on him, his men's, the Reverend's, and something else. Something unseen that he pushed open the door of the cabin. It creaked like it was sighing, like it was tired of keeping its secrets. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. Dust floated through the lantern light. Gosh, the place looked abandoned, but the fire pit in the center still held the faint glow of dying embers. Someone had been there. Then he saw it. On the far wall, drawn in what looked like charcoal or blood, was a mark, a spiral with 3 lines cutting through it. The same mark that had haunted him for 20 years. The same mark that burned in his dreams. The Reverend pushed past him, eyes wide. "The sign of the witch," he hissed. "She's here." The men outside shouted. Something moved in the trees. A figure, small, pale, darted between the lantern lights. Someone fired a shot. Another lantern fell and shattered, flames licking at the wet ground. Panic rippled through the group. The forest lit up in flashes of fire and gunpowder. Sheriff Marin ran out, shouting for them to stop. "Hold your fire. That's not her," he yelled. But his voice was lost in the chaos. The figure stumbled into the clearing, and the world seemed to stop. It was Grace. Her hair tangled, her clothes torn and stained with mud. Her eyes looked distant, unfocused, like she wasn't entirely there. The sheriff dropped his rifle and rushed to her, pulling her close. She didn't speak, just stared past him toward the cabin. Her lips moved soundlessly. Then the Reverend's voice cut through the silence. "She's not your daughter anymore, Clay," he said, his tone almost gentle. "Look at her eyes." The sheriff turned. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. Grace's pupils were wide and dark, her skin cold beneath his hands. He tried to speak, but no words came. She trembled, gasped, and then she laughed. It wasn't a human laugh. It was low and sharp, like the crack of breaking wood. The Reverend raised his gun. The sheriff stood between them. "You'll have to shoot me first," he said. The Reverend didn't hesitate. The sound shattered the night. Grace screamed, a sound that wasn't just hers. It was layered, echoing, filled with centuries of pain. The lanterns blew out all at once, and the forest came alive. The trees groaned, the ground shook, and the air filled with the smell of burning pine and blood. The men ran. Some dropped their weapons, others fell and didn't rise again. Those who survived later said the ground opened up in the hollow, swallowing the fire and the cabin whole. They said they saw a woman standing in the flames, her hair white as smoke, her hands reaching out toward the sheriff's body. They said she whispered something before the earth closed, something no one could understand. When the sun rose, the hollow was empty. The cabin was gone. All that remained was a patch of blackened soil and the sheriff's badge lying in the mud. Grace's body was never found. For days, the town stayed silent. The Reverend locked himself in the church, praying until his voice broke. Some said he'd gone blind overnight. Others said he'd been taken too. No one dared enter the hollow again. But on the 7th night, the church bell rang once more. A single, long toll that echoed through the valley. When they found the Reverend's Bible open on the altar, The page was marked by a dark handprint, the same spiral drawn beside it in blood. And outside, at the edge of town, someone saw a light moving through the trees, a lantern swaying slowly back and forth, leading the way toward Black Hollow. They say if you follow it, you can still hear the sheriff calling her name. And if you listen closer, you can hear her answered, in the weeks that follow the night of the fire, the town of Forsyth seemed to stop breathing. Smoke still lingered over the ridges long after the flames had died, clinging to the air like a ghost refusing to leave. People spoke in whispers, doors stayed locked, and even the sound of a wagon while rolling down the dirt road felt too loud. The world felt smaller, quieter, like something had been taken from it that could never be replaced. No one went near Black Hollow anymore. The sheriff's men, what was left of them, swore they'd seen the earth itself split open T. At night, some said they saw the sheriff vanish into it. Others claimed he was dragged down by a shadow that wore a woman's face. None of them ever agreed on what really happened. What they did agree on was that the hollow was cursed, and that whatever had happened there was not meant to be understood. Reverend Porter was never the same again. For 3 days after the fire, he locked himself in the church, praying so loudly the sound echoed down the empty streets. When he finally came out, his hair had gone completely white. He wouldn't speak to anyone, wouldn't eat, wouldn't look at the cross above the altar. He spent his last days sitting by the church window, staring toward the mountains, lips moving without sound. Some said he was trying to repent. Others believed he was waiting for something or someone to come for him. One night, he vanished without a trace, leaving only his Bible open on the pew, the pages warped by moisture that wasn't water. The few who remained in town tried to carry on. Stores opened, fields were tended, but the sense of community was gone. Families who had lived there for generations packed their wagons and headed east, saying they'd rather face the unknown than stay in a place that had seen so much death. Those who stayed rarely spoke of the Marins or the Hollow. It became an unspoken rule, something sacred and terrifying. Children were told never to wander past the ridge. Travelers who asked too many questions were met with blank stares and quick goodbyes. But for those who had been closest to it, the silence was unbearable. Samuel Griggs' widow, who'd lost her husband to the Hollow long before the fire, was seen wandering the woods some nights, holding a lantern and calling his name. When people tried to stop her, she'd say she could hear him calling back. One morning, her lantern was found still burning beside the creek. She was never seen again. Grace's disappearance weighed heavily on the town than anyone would admit. To some, she was a victim, an innocent soul caught in a storm of fear and superstition. To others, she was proof that evil could hide behind the sweetest face. For Sheriff Marin, she had been his only light, and with her gone, the last of his humanity went too. But for the few who still believed in him, there was pity more than anger. They whispered that he'd tried to save her, that he'd fought to his dying breath. Some claimed they'd seen his ghost near the edge of the hollow, still calling her name into the trees. The town's official story became simple, clean enough to live with. They said the sheriff had gone mad from grief and set fire to the woods, killing himself and his daughter in the process. The Reverend had tried to save them and vanished in the attempt. That was the version printed in the county papers, the one that made it easier to sleep at night. But no one really believed it. You could see it in their faces, how they flinched when the wind blew from the direction of the mountains, how they crossed themselves when the dogs started howling after midnight. The land itself seemed to remember. Crops wouldn't grow near the hollow anymore, no matter how many times they tried. The soil was black and rich, but the seeds died in it. The trees grew twisted, their trunks bending in ways that looked unnatural. Travelers who passed through the Ozarks told stories of hearing singing deep in the woods, a woman's voice carrying through the mist. Some said they saw a faint light moving through the trees, a lantern swinging slowly back and forth, just out of reach. Decades passed, and the town changed names, rebuilt its church, and paved its roads, but the shadow of the hollow never left. Parents warned their children not to wander past the old ridge, and old-timers at the general store still spoke about that night like it had happened yesterday. Every generation had its own version of the story. The witch, the sheriff, the daughter, the curse. But the ending was always the same. No one who entered Black Hollow ever came back. For those who believed, the curse wasn't just about the witch. It was about guilt, about what fear does when it's given power. The Reverend had used faith to feed fear. The townsfolk had used fear to excuse cruelty. And in the end, the forest had taken them all, piece by piece. Some said it was God's justice. Others said it was hers. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when people claimed they felt something else in the hollow. Not anger, but sadness. A kind of mourning that came from the earth itself, like it were grieving what had been lost. On still nights, when the fog rolled low through the valley and the moon shone pale over the hills, the air would fill with the faint sound of humming, a tune soft and broken, like someone remembering a lullaby they once loved. Those who heard it said it didn't scare them. It made them ache, because in that sound they swore they could feel all the pain, all the regret, all the love that had been twisted by fear and fire. And long after the last witness to those events was gone, after the last log cabin had rotted and the forest had swallowed what remained of Forsyth, travelers still spoke of Black Hollow. They said the ground there breathes. That's when you stand too long in the clearing, you can feel the heartbeat of the mountain beneath your feet. And if you listen closely, if you truly listen, you can hear two voices in the dark point, one calling out in sorrow. The other answered softly, as if she had finally found peace. Years passed, and time did what it always does. It blurred the edges of memory until even the sharpest pain began to dull. But in the Ozark Mountains, the story of the mountain, witch, and the night the hollow burned never truly faded. It lingered like smoke in the air, a tale too heavy to die, carried from one generation to the next in hushed voices and firelight. And while the names of the people changed, the lesson stayed the same. Fear, once planted, grows deeper roots than truth ever could, and Oak Court ever ruled on what happened that night. There were no trials, no official charges, no justice as the world understands it. Sheriff Clay Marin was buried without ceremony, a plain wooden cross marking the spot beside the river he used to fish with. H's children, his badge, scorched and bent, was placed on his grave by the few men who still respected him. They never spoke of what they saw in those final moments, but their eyes told everything. Haunted, broken, and forever changed. Grace Marin was never found, but her name lived on longer than anyone expected. In some tellings, she was a victim, an innocent caught between her father's guilt and the town's fear. In others, she was the witch reborn, the curse made flesh, returned to punish the men who wronged her bloodline. Truth became a thing no one could claim anymore. She became less a person than a story, a symbol of what happens when lies are mistaken for faith and vengeance hides behind the mask of righteousness. The Reverend's church stood empty for decades after his disappearance. The new preachers who came tried to cleanse it. New paint, new sermons, new hymns, but the pews never filled again. The people had lost faith, not just in God, but in themselves. They'd seen what blind belief could do, how easily it could turn mercy into murder. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. The Reverend's war on evil had destroyed more good than it ever saved. As years turned into decades, the story of Black Hollow became folklore. Outsiders came to hear it. The ghost hunters, the journalists, the wanderers searching for something unexplainable. Some came looking for proof of the supernatural. Others came looking for redemption. They always left the same way, quiet, uneasy, and changed in a way they couldn't put into words. What no one ever realized was that the curse wasn't magic. It wasn't a ghost or a spell buried in the soil. It was fear, the kind that spreads like wildfire through a small town when people stop seeing each other as human. Fear gave the witcher power. Fear kept the men blind until their hands were stained with blood. And in the end, it was fear that consumed them all. Justice, if it existed, didn't come from courts or scripture. It came from the land itself, the only witness that remembered everything. The hollow stayed empty, but not silent. The forest grew back, wild and untamed, swallowing the remains of the cabin and the bones of the men who thought they could destroy what they didn't understand. In time, nature did what people couldn't. It buried the past, but it never forgot. Strangely, the story of the mountain, which revealed more about the living than the dead. It showed how desperation makes monsters out of ordinary men, how guilt can twist faith into something cruel, and how love, real love, can drive a man to madness when faced with loss. The sheriff wasn't evil, nor was the reverend entirely righteous. They were two sides of the same coin, both believing they were saving something sacred, both blind to the destruction they caused. The people who survived learned to live with what they'd done, but the weight of it never truly left them. Some tried to justify it by saying they'd done God's work. Others turned away from the church entirely, too ashamed to face their own reflections. Families who once shared fences and Sunday meals stopped speaking altogether. Children grew up hearing the story, warned not to repeat the mistakes of their elders. But history has a way of looping back on itself. That be why the early 1900s, Forsyth was barely a shadow of the town it once was. The railroad passed it by, the mills closed, and new towns rose to the east where the soil was safer. But even there, the legend followed. Travelers told stories of a woman seen wandering the ridges, her lantern cutting through the fog. They said she didn't speak, only watched, her eyes sad more than angry. Some believed she guarded the hollow, protecting it from the living. Others said she was still searching for her father, for peace, or for forgiveness that never came to. In the end, there was no victory, no moral high ground. There's only the simple, terrible truth that people fear what they don't understand. And when fear is fed long enough, it becomes its own kind of evil. The curse of Black Hollow wasn't about spells or spirits. It was about how easily a community can lose its soul in the name of righteousness. If there's any redemption in the story, it's in the quiet moments. The way the forest regrew where the cabin once stood, the way wildflowers began to bloom each spring in the same patch of soil where the fire burned hottest. Life found its way back, stubborn and beautiful, as if reminding the world that no darkness lasts forever. Some say that on clear nights, if you stand at the edge of the hollow, you can still hear two voices, a man's and a woman's, speaking softly over the wind. They don't sound angry anymore, just tired. Maybe that's all justice really is. Not revenge, not punishment, but the slow fading of pain into something that can be remembered without hate. The world kept turning, the hollow kept breathing, and the legend became part of the mountain's bones. And though no one dares to live near Black Hollow even now, flowers still grow there, white and small, their petals shaped like little hands reaching upward. Some say they grow from the roots of the past, from love twisted by loss, from guilt that never found rest. Others say they're just flowers, nothing more. But those who know the story understand. The land remembers,